Open your eyes!
Episode 215, this one's all about a band called Remnants. They play death metal. They're a band that I see mentioned pretty often when people are doing the whole super retarded caveman, groove, slam, death, brutal, blah, blah, blah. Death metal speech that so many people seem to feel a pathological need to make. But outside of that, I don't really see a lot of like in-depth discussion about their music, which I think is a damn shame, because these guys are one of my two favorite Japanese death metal bands. The other one, of course, being Intestine Balism, that I did an embarrassingly long episode about way back on episode 92. In some ways, they are quite similar. They both started way back in the 90s, and they both take a really long time to put an album out. Remnants has been around since 1997. They've put 2 albums out, one in 1999 and one in 2017. Intestine Balism started in 1994, and they've only put out 3 albums in 97, 2003, and 2008. And whilst these two bands do not share members, the current drummer for Intestine Balism also played drums in the grindcore bands Butcher ABC around the same time that one of the ex-Vomit Remnants guitarists was playing bass in that band and doing vocals. Lovely. However, apart from those connections, these bands really couldn't be more different. Intestine Balism and Vomit Remnants. I mean, Intestine Balism are well known for being perhaps the melodic death metal band that is best at keeping the death in melodic death metal. For more about that, watch the Intestine Balism episode. I have a lot to say about that band. Whereas Vomit Remnants, well, we'll find out what their deal is. Both of these guys were both heavily influenced by Suffocation, but in the case of Vomit Remnants, way more so. Like, these guys probably wouldn't exist without Suffocation. And we kind of need to talk about Suffocation in general to get an idea of where Vomit Remnants are coming from. So if you don't know Suffocation, you should, if you're into death metal at all. I mean, everybody knows Suffocation. They're a death metal band from New York. Oh! And they're notable for being kind of unique in terms of how they influence other bands. And that there's tons of bands that literally would not exist without Suffocation. But whereas, let's say a band is like heavily influenced by Entombed and probably wouldn't exist without Entombed, you get like Entombed sounds like this. And then over here you got God Defied, and they just sound like... You know, it's pretty much the same thing. And it's pretty much like that with most death metal bands that are clearly heavily influenced by one singular band. They just kind of end up sounding like that band. But it's not like that with Suffocation. And I think this is because Suffocation has a very multifaceted sound to the point where you could almost birth entirely new subgenres out of it just by concentrating on one element. For instance, Suffocation was instrumental in the development of what we call like technical death metal nowadays, because they did stuff like this. You get the super complex drumming with these long, winding tremolo pick guitar riffs that then go into stuff like weird little transitions like that. They're big on these like odd rhythmic transitions between different riffs. Like these cascading dissonant note combinations. Then you got bands like Deeds of Flesh where they're like message received and understood. You know, they base their whole sound off of that. And by kind of laser focusing in on that aspect of Suffocation sound, they come up with their own sound that's still clearly heavily influenced by Suffocation. So you see the long winding tremolo riffs, those weird transitions, stuff like this. But not every band that was heavily influenced by Suffocation sounded exactly like that, and that's because Suffocation has a lot of different signature facets to their sound, another one of which is kind of underrated by the metal community at large, and that would be their penchant for including sort of a twisted sense of melody into their brutal death metal. This is most notable specifically on a lot of the songs penned by Terrence Hobbs in the early 90s. See, it starts out brutal, but it goes into these layered, weird, nasty melodic riffs that aren't mellow death, but still pretty consonant. Bands that heavily focused on this aspect of Suffocation's sound in their own music would include Cryptopsy. So yeah, you know, they do the song, it starts out pretty brutal with this weird fucking like polka drum beat, but then you get this cool little melodic bit. This one is Serial Messiah off of the first and best Cryptopsy album, Don't At Me. Other bands that were also influenced by this aspect of Suffocation would be Vehemence, another one of my favorite bands, and Intestine Balism themselves. But we all know what the most famous aspect of Suffocation is, at least amongst the modern middling IQ death metal crowd. You want to hear it? Here it go! The classic brutal death metal breakdown that originates with Suffocation. Not only did it pretty much invent deathcore for better or for worse, but it also invented slam death, which is kind of what Vomit Remnants are considered. I mean, they predate the term, and whereas a lot of this music is categorized as being, it's like so dumb it's great, it's just like so brutal and stupid, I love it. Vomit Remnants isn't really very dumb at all. In fact, they're a pretty complex sounding band, and they pull heavily from that aspect of Suffocation sound. This band's style is heavily defined by Keisuke Suboi's drumming. In fact, he's been the only constant member of the band, and yet they haven't changed styles that much over the years, which leads me to believe that he wrote a lot of the music. Whilst this band's riffs are not melodically complex, they are incredibly rhythmically complex. The guitars themselves are almost played like a drum set, with the snare drum being the lower pitched chug riffs, and then the crash cymbal is the artificial harmonics. That wah noise. And here we get to the breakdowns, which are Vomit Remnants' most famous feature. This one in Prodigy of Solitude is really cool because it introduces it very slowly and then it double times it. It's sort of like a very brutal circling of the drain into the abyss. These guys are big on that kind of songwriting where they give ideas a lot of breathing room. They gradually introduce new themes, often as the part of like a prior riff is then expanded upon into a whole new set of riffs. And they'll even hold on one singular riff for a while and just run it through a bunch of different texture variations, which is what they're doing right now. And then once that idea has been thoroughly explored, they move on to the next set of riff ideas that act as a counterpoint to what came before. It's a very mathematically precise band. So there's something that people like to bring up with this whole like breakdowns and death metal thing, where it's like, isn't that sort of like nu metal or even like a hip hop thing? Now with Suffocation, not really. In fact, Mike Smith, the most famous Suffocation drummer and kind of like the driving force of that band's sense of rhythm in the early days, has explicitly stated in interviews that he doesn't really care for like rap at all. However, at least in the case of Vomit Remnants, not only do they utilize the guitars like a drum, where like the chuggy bits are the snare, the tremolo parts are like the double bass, and then the artificial harmonics are acting like the cymbals, they also utilize their vocals like another percussion instrument. To the point where it almost sounds like he's death growl rapping, albeit not nearly to the extent that you would see in a band like Dying Fetus. The degree of busyness in Keisuke Suboi's drumming is a big part of why this style works for me, whereas with a lot of other bands it falls flat. Cool little cymbal trick. And we get into another example of this band gradually introducing new ideas, where they run a set of riffs through a whole bunch of variations, adding and subtracting various elements. You see right here they sped it up, and they added this weird little tremolo thing at the end. That odd dissonant bendy bit. I love that. And then it goes into a breakdown. Because it's Vomit Remnants, and they fucking love doing that. And I love it when they do it, because they're really good at it. That's not even to say it's all entirely pulled from the Suffocation school of breakdowns. Some of their songs even have like a decent amount of thrash influence in it, which is pretty interesting. This song is called My Blessed Sickness. It's off their first full-length album, and this is almost like if a Suffocation-style band tried to write a Megadeth riff. Just a really weird, interesting way of doing a very heavy thrash metal riff in a much more death metal style. And including a lot of like weird, twisted melodies in it too, like this odd little tremolo bit right here. The soul of this song is very much anchored in 80s thrash metal with these sort of like very staircase style riffs kind of just going up and down. Here's another cool bit of their very clever songwriting where they sort of let ideas cross-pollinate with each other because they've got the thrashy bit there, right? But then they started introducing this weird slidey thing back into the thrash metal riff. But they're going to bring that back in a more notable context right here where they really like hammer in on that and repeat it. See how they gradually introduce this like weird sliding idea, and then watch what they do with this. Like the really heavy bass playing, then you got these layered guitars. Almost sounds like something off of the first At the Gates album, The Red in the Sky Is Ours. And then that leads into this like fucked up breakdown that's still utilizing that sort of like sliding melodic guitar concept, filling in between the chugs. And it's still got that sort of like weird hip-hop-ish vocal cadence. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff going on in this song in particular. And then there's a cool little bass fill, leading directly into a guitar solo section that sounds exactly like something you'd hear on the first Suffocation album, but it's still got that weird thrashy rip under it that is very much unlike a typical Suffocation-style riff. I want to go back to that idea of they're utilizing harmonic guitar notes, you know, the noise, in a very artistic manner, specifically on the first song on their first album, where they use like a whole bunch of different pitched harmonics as an important part of like the main melody of the song. You see, these weird guitar noises are incorporated into the main melody of the riff itself, which I find to be rather interesting. I've also heard that happen in Argusland a lot, but obviously in a much less dissonant and nasty manner. And of course, we're building up to a full stop followed by a breakdown, where they're going to do that cool tempo variation thing again. Like right now, we're in the mid-paced version of this riff, and then it goes into the super fast version of the riff, which also incorporates a little bit of that weird harmonic shit from earlier. And then the counterpoint to this riff is fantastic. It almost has a little bit of melody to it in a very perverse way. I would say this is one of their most balanced sounding songs. It's very symmetrical because you had that mid-pace part that then repeated itself in fast mode, and then the corresponding breakdown riff started out super fast and then went back into this more like mid-pace thing. It all sort of balanced itself out in a very interesting way. The only real problem I have with Vomit Remnants is there's just such a dearth of material from them. Like, I've played you stuff off of their first album, and then the first two songs I played from them were off of the Indefensible Vehemence EP that came out a couple years after their first album. After that, they kind of went silent until a new full-length finally came out in 2017. I say kind of went silent because despite a lot of member shakeups, they were still putting out lots of demos and promos and stuff. And these promo tapes really showcase another new interesting addition to their style. For instance, this one from 2004, entitled Extinction of Worthless Humanity, which is a wonderful song title, shows them moving in a much more fast-paced direction, even compared to their already rather speedy material at times from earlier. And yeah, it goes into, you know, your nasty breakdown thing, but remember that really fast riff from earlier, because we're about to go into this weird variation on it. It's almost like a reversed version of it, but then it has this weird, like, diminished thing at the end of it, right here. And then the counter statement to that is an even stranger riff where they're doing these almost kind of like fucked up voivod fill-in bits that tie together the chugs. Really am feeling this. Also, that drum beat right there is cool. It's simple, but it's atypical for death metal. And then it breaks down because it's Vomit Remnants. That's what they do. They do really good breakdowns. But more than that, they just write really, really good death metal. They have a very unique sound to them. I think that the fact that the drums are mic'd so strangely and he like incorporates pads and just like weird metallic snares and everything, honestly, rather than taking away from the music, it like adds to it. It gives it a very inhuman feel, and I enjoy pretty much all of their material. If you're trying to get into them, their Bandcamp, they still have copies up of something called Collecting the Remnants, which includes their first album, the Indefensible Vehemence EP, all of their demos, and all of like the weird promos that led up to the eventual issuance of their second album on 2 discs. If you act now, you can actually get it signed by Kensuke Tsuboi, which is fucking awesome. So go and do that if you like death metal, dude. Vomit Remnants fucking rules. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Во, настоящий медведь. Настоящий медведь. 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 Ой, мать моя женщина, медведь на мотоцикле. Паша, обгоняй с этой стороны. Стой тут медленно. Вот это да, вот это круто. О-о-о-о.